Yeah.
Tankersley uses a simple hand-powered coring tool. The deeper they drive it into the ground,
Got it.
the older the layer of fossils they extract. He finds a bone bed, a layer littered with fossils of creatures that are now extinct.
Going back.
The reason we have a bone bed is because the environment's going under rapid, profound global climatic change. Let's see what we have in here.
Tankersley's layer of fossils dates to the end of the Pleistocene era, a time of dramatic climate change. He finds the remains of strange and ancient creatures, all of which have vanished from the face of the Earth.
Beautiful preservation. Excellent.
Looks like it was probably from the heather vole, the giant snapping turtle, a piece of pygmy shrew, a phalange, or toe bone, if you will, of Platygonus compressus.
Platygonus compressus is a kind of giant pig. It's one of a group of creatures hardest hit by sudden climate change, the megamammals.
Megamammals are literally giant beasts that lived during the last ice age. Imagine for a moment a beaver that was the size of a black bear, or a ground sloth that was the size of a tree.
Tankersley believes many of the megamammals died at the end of the Pleistocene as the climate changed. It's uncertain why they disappeared, but Tankersley thinks sudden climate change played a role in wiping them off the face of the planet.
More than 30 different types of megamammals disappeared in a very short period of time.
The megamammals had very slow reproductive rates. It could be that the lengthy period between generations meant they were slower to adapt to change.
The climate changed rapidly and profoundly and globally, so fast that the megamammals did not have a chance.
Tankersley's research shows that sudden climate change can affect the survival of a species. What would it mean to us if the weather suddenly changed? A drop of a few degrees can cause crops like corn, rice, and wheat to fail, leading to global famine. Tankersley fears that humanity may stand little chance of survival if a massive freeze strikes.
Now, if we were to have another ice age, what we need for our own survival, if we were to land, would be tied up in glacial ice. The amount of areas that would be inhabitable, the amount of areas where we could produce food would be greatly reduced.
Could humanity be living on borrowed time? Could we too be wiped off the face of the planet? Understanding what triggers these climate swings may be our only chance of survival. But so far, the news is not good. It appears that we could be the ones who set off the next major freeze. Earth is currently in an interglacial period, one that has had an unusually stable climate, allowing civilization to flourish. But it turns out that this stable weather we have enjoyed is in fact a freak of nature, and sudden swings between cold and warm are the norm. And worryingly, one of these sudden coolings might strike sooner than you think. Scientists are keen to discover what triggers rapid and sustained climate change. Volcanoes can cause short-term cooling, but what about giant freezes?
If volcanoes could get organized, they could rule the world. But they don't seem capable of triggering ice ages. There's no way for an Alaskan volcano to tell an Indonesian volcano that it's time to erupt.
The cause of giant freezes may lie deep within our oceans. Temperature plays an important role in the movement of ocean currents. Warm water is less dense than cold water, so it tends to rise. Conversely, cold water is more dense, so it tends to sink. The seas at the equator receive more sunlight than those at the poles. So water here warms up and rises and moves toward the colder polar water. This movement is called the Great Ocean Conveyor. Once the warm water arrives at the poles, it cools and then sinks and is forced back to the equator along the ocean floor. The movement of warm water carries with it warm air. In the North Atlantic, that air movement is called the Gulf Stream. It carries the heat equivalent of the output of 1 million power stations. It's the main reason why England stays relatively warm, while at the same latitude, Canada has ice fields. The movement of warm water and air not only spreads warmth around the world, it also helps stabilize weather patterns. This stability helps civilization to flourish and sees our population soar from a mere 4 million to over 6 billion people today. But the ocean currents have not always flowed so reliably. If the function of the global conveyor water current is to keep the climate stable, how could it set off a freeze? The theory says that if the conveyor stops, then the distribution of warm water and warm air also stops, and this could lead to climate change. But what on earth would be powerful enough to stop the conveyor? One clue may come from the last big freeze to hit the planet. As our planet exits the last ice age around 13,000 years ago, temperatures start to rise. This causes the North American ice sheet to melt, and a vast lake of fresh water is trapped where Hudson Bay lies today. This lake is dammed by mountains of ice. But in one dramatic event, these dams burst. 2,500 trillion gallons of fresh water pour into the North Atlantic. That's about 450 times the volume that passes over Niagara Falls every day. This immense influx of fresh water drastically decreases the salinity of the North Atlantic. This wouldn't matter, apart from one vital fact. Fresh water is less dense than salt water. It refuses to sink. These density changes mean that the Great Ocean Conveyor starts to slow down, and warm air stops circulating. Weather patterns are affected, and temperatures drop. Richard Alley's ice core records show dramatic swings in climate all over the world.
It affected probably the northern hemisphere almost instantly, and the southern hemisphere within 100 years or so.
This freeze is known as the Younger Dryas. Ice core records show that it chilled our planet for more than 1,000 years. This was the last big freeze to strike our world. But why worry? This happened over 10,000 years ago. Well, today, it might be happening again. Something is affecting the natural balance of our planet. Something that could bring our stable weather to an abrupt end sooner than we or scientists thought. Global warming. If you think this means longer summers and pleasant winters, you're going to be very disappointed. Global warming is throwing our fragile weather into disarray, and nobody knows what the consequences will be.
The Earth's climate is a little bit like a drunken human being. If you leave it alone, it just sits there. And when you force it to move, rather than going smoothly, it staggers on its way.
It is not known if our planet will keep the stable, pleasant weather we have enjoyed for the last 10,000 years. But some scientists worry that rising global temperatures might be upsetting our delicate climate system more than we realize. They suspect that global warming might actually push us staggering into a new freeze. As the temperature rises, the melting Arctic ice and glaciers and ice sheets will pour cold, fresh water into the oceans. This could slow down the ocean conveyor and cause a drop in temperature in parts of the globe.
There's this slight worry that we are warming the world, and that this will cause melting in Greenland. And if too much fresh water gets into the North Atlantic, global warming could cause freezing around the North Atlantic, so that some people would actually see a rather startling cooling from global warming.
It may sound unlikely, but scientists are currently carrying out studies to learn just how big an impact global warming might have on global freezing. Many, like climatologist Don Perovich, have traveled to Barrow, Alaska, the most northerly settlement in the U.S., to study global warming.
If there is global warming, this will be where you'll see it first. This will be where the signal's the largest. So naturally, that's where you want to look.
Perovich studies the impact of global warming on ice cover. His findings are disturbing.
Roughly speaking, the Arctic sea ice covers around the size of the United States. And if you look back over the past 30 years, each decade it's lost an equivalent size of New Hampshire and Colorado.
Some scientists believe that Arctic sea ice in summer may disappear completely within 5 decades. This devastating warming is thought to be caused by emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. To help understand the effects of this warming, Perovich travels out onto the Arctic sea ice. He drills a hole through the ice to measure its thickness. Perovich's studies reveal that the Arctic ice is not just shrinking, it's also thinning.
We see the areas changing a few percent per decade, and you might say, well, so what? Well, there's another dimension to the ice cover, and that's its thickness. And we really want to know how that's changing.
In the 1960s, the Arctic sea ice was on average more than 10 feet thick. Today, it's under 6.
And that's a 40% decrease in the overall average thickness. Perennial ice cover could be gone in 50 years. What that means is that in the summer there'd be no Arctic sea ice. And that's something that hasn't occurred in hundreds, if not thousands of years.
This loss of Arctic sea ice could lead to disaster. The ice is acting as a plug, stopping glaciers of freshwater ice from simply pouring into oceans. When sea ice disappears, these freshwater glaciers surge into the oceans unchecked. This decreases the salinity of the oceans and disrupts the smooth running of the Great Ocean Conveyor. Every year, glaciers the size of Rhode Island crash into the sea, adding more than 300 trillion gallons of fresh water. As more and more ice melts, just as it did around 13,000 years ago, it could threaten to trigger another big freeze. But at present, nobody knows if or when it will happen, or how severe it could be. But if it's even a fraction as severe as the Younger Dryas freeze, it could threaten life as we know it. The Earth may be facing a sudden cooling. Around 13,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the planet rapidly warmed. It's believed that the ocean conveyor shut down, triggering a sudden freeze. Today, global warming is melting glaciers and ice sheets, and thereby freshening our oceans. And scientists are worried that this climate change could trigger another giant freeze. Oceanographer Neil Bogue has come to the Greenland coast to study the North Atlantic. He believes that right now, global warming may be shutting down the ocean conveyor, endangering our planet.
I think there's evidence to indicate that it's slowing down. Whether it will continue or whether there will be a reversal, these are the things that our research hopes to answer.
Bogue and his team measure the salinity and temperature of the Labrador Sea, a crucial part